Chapter 12, The Invisible Struggle. The morning after their return from the submerged Atlantean city arrived not with the gentle grace of ordinary dawn, but with the quality of light that seemed to carry weight, as if photons themselves had been charged with intention that demanded conscious recognition to perceive. The air hummed with frequencies that existed just below the threshold of hearing, creating an atmospheric tension that made the familiar cityscape feel like a stage set for drama whose script had not yet been revealed. Maya woke in her studio apartment to find the space filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source she could identify. These were not the comforting shadows of furniture and architectural features, but presences, entities of organized darkness that seemed to have been waiting with infinite patience for her consciousness to develop sufficient clarity to acknowledge their existence. They watched her morning routine with attention so focused it felt almost tactile, evaluating every gesture, measuring every thought, assessing the quality of presence she brought to each familiar action. When she reached for her violin, transformed by its exposure to Atlantean conscious technologies, the shadows recoiled slightly but did not disappear. Instead, they seemed to reorganize themselves into more strategic positions, as if preparing for some form of engagement that would require all their accumulated intelligence about human psychology and spiritual development. Joe discovered that his morning coffee ritual had attracted an audience of invisible observers whose attention felt like gentle pressure against his consciousness. As he went through the familiar choreography of grinding beans and calibrating his espresso machine, he could sense evaluation focused on him from directions that had no physical coordinates, assessments that seemed to measure not just his technical skill, but the quality of intention he brought to each element of the process. The sensation was not unpleasant, but carried undertones that made his skin prickle with recognition of forces that operated according to laws he had never learned to perceive. When he activated his coffee meditation device, the invisible watchers seemed to lean closer, as if his expansion into enhanced consciousness had triggered protocols they had been programmed to implement under specific circumstances. Elena found her university laboratory filled with energy readings that challenged every assumption her scientific training had provided about the nature of reality. Her instruments detected patterns of organized interference that seemed intentional rather than random, as if unseen intelligences were conducting experiments that used her own research as raw material for investigations that extended far beyond her conscious understanding. Her dream microscope revealed layers of activity in the laboratory atmosphere that suggested the presence of entities whose existence operated at the intersection of thought and matter, consciousness forms that seemed to be studying her as intensively as she studied the phenomenon that had captured her scientific curiosity. The realization that she might be the subject of research being conducted by intelligence she couldn't perceive created a cognitive dissonance that made her question fundamental assumptions about who was observing what in any given experimental situation. Leo's studio had been transformed overnight into what could only be described as a battlefield where artistic inspiration warred with the forces of creative destruction. His canvases bore marks he didn't remember making, not the fluid expressions of his integrated consciousness, but jagged interruptions that seemed designed to disrupt the flow of creative processes before it could achieve coherent manifestation. His reality marking device sparked and then stuttered when he tried to use it, producing distorted images that writhed with what appeared to be malevolent intelligence rather than serving as tools for artistic expression. The interference was systematic rather than random, suggesting that something was with detailed understanding of creative process, was actively working to prevent him from accessing the artistic capabilities he had developed throughout his inner work. Tariq woke with his usual spontaneous laughter, replaced by heaviness he couldn't name, or locate in any specific aspect of his experience. The feeling was like being underwater, not drowning, but moving through resistance that made every gesture require more effort than should have been necessary. His mechanical laugh device sat in silence on his bedside table, its mechanisms apparently jammed by forces that seemed to feed on joy and sought to prevent its expression through any technological amplification. Even his most reliable sources of humor felt flat, lifeless, drained of the healing power he had come to trust as one of his primary tools for consciousness transformation. The comedy routines that usually emerged from his consciousness creativity from it, the comedy routines that usually emerged from his unconscious creativity felt forced, artificial, as if something was actively interfering with his access to the spontaneous wit that had always been his natural gift. They converged at the Meridian Cafe. In the pre-dawn darkness, each carrying their transformed instruments and a shared understanding that their recent expansions had attracted attention from quarters that they had never learned to recognize or defend against. The familiar cafe space felt charged with tension that existed in dimensions they couldn't name, but could definitely feel. Invisible currents of conflict that seemed to flow through the atmosphere like electrical storms in consciousness itself. The recognition of invisible ecosystems. "We're not alone anymore," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying undertones of wonder mixed with apprehension. Her violin created harmonics that seemed to push back against pressures she couldn't identify. Not mechanical resistance, but something that felt like opposing intentions meeting in the space where thought becomes action. Elena activated her dream microscope, studying the energy patterns that swirled through the cafe's atmosphere with the focused attention of a researcher who had stumbled onto phenomena that threatened to revolutionize her entire field of study. What she observed confirmed their collective intuitions, while adding layers of complexity that made the situation both more fascinating and more dangerous than any of them had initially suspected. The space was populated with entities that existed at the intersection of thought and emotion, consciousness forms that had apparently learned to sustain themselves by consuming specific types of human awareness. They moved through the cafe like schools of invisible fish, following currents of attention and intention that operated according to laws Elena's scientific training had never taught her to recognize. "They're not just random phenomena," she said, adjusting her instruments to capture more detailed readings of the entity's behavior patterns. "These are organized intelligences that have evolved sophisticated strategies for interacting with human consciousness. They seem to understand our psychological structures better than most humans understand them." Joe felt his coffee meditation device resisting his attempts to activate it, as if invisible hands were interfering with its mechanisms while simultaneously studying how the mechanisms functioned. The interference was selective rather than comprehensive. Some functions remained accessible while others systemically were blocked, suggesting that whatever was causing the resistance possessed detailed knowledge of how consciousness enhancement technologies operated. "They're trying to prevent us from accessing the states of awareness that threaten their survival," he observed, working around the blocked functions to activate alternative pathways through his device. "But they're also learning from our responses, adapting their strategies based on how we adapt to their interference." Leo attempted to sketch what Elena was observing through her dream microscope. but his reality marking device produced only twisted, distorted images that seemed to arrive with autonomous intelligence rather than serving as neural tools for artistic expression. The distortions were not random artifacts, but they appeared to be conscious attempts to prevent accurate documentation of the entity's activities. They don't want to be seen, he said, studying the way his artistic instruments malfunctioned in specific patterns. Visibility diminishes their power, but they're sophisticated enough to recognize when they're being observed and take countermeasures to protect their anonymity. Tariq tried to activate his mechanical laugh device, but found that the mechanism stubbornly was being unresponsive to his usual techniques. The silence was not mechanical failure, but seemed to result from interference with the device's capacity to generate the specific frequencies that produced healing laughter. They feed on the opposite of what we've learned to cultivate, he realized. Joy starves them. Presence threatens them. Integration makes them desperate enough to reveal themselves through their resistance to our development. The arrival of the teachers. The stranger materialized from the shadows that seemed deeper and more substantial than the pre-dawn darkness should have allowed. But his usual calm presence now carried undertones of urgency that made the air around him crackle with barely contained energy. Instead of his weathered coat or the twilight robes they had seen him wear in other contexts, he appeared in what could only be described as armor. Not metal or conventional protective materials, but crystallized intention that seemed to have been forged from pure attention and tempered through countless encounters with forces that most humans never learned to recognize. His eyes held the focused alertness of a warrior who had spent lifetimes learning to navigate territories where consciousness itself served as both weapon and battlefield. When he moved, patterns of light and shadow shifted around him in ways that suggested he existed in constant interaction with invisible forces that required continuous awareness to manage safely. The integration you achieve through your inner journeys, he said without preamble, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to push back against the oppressive atmosphere in the cafe, has disrupted equilibriums that have existed for millennia. Each genuine expansion of consciousness creates turbulence in the invisible ecosystems that surround and interpenetrate human awareness. Today you will learn not just how to recognize these forces, but to defend the territory you've claimed in consciousness itself. Lady Amira emerged from what appeared to be empty space behind the cafe's storage room, though none of them had observed her entering the building through any conventional entrance. She carried objects that looked like weapons, but were clearly designed for warfare that took place entirely in realms of consciousness rather than physical space. Blades of focused awareness that seemed to cut through illusion rather than matter. Shields of integrating understanding that deflected psychic attack rather than physical force. Tools whose functions could only be understood by consciousness that had developed the capacity to work directly with the fundamental forces of awareness itself. The invisible struggle, she explained, distributing the consciousness weapons amongst them with careful attention, or the careful attention of an instructor preparing students for examinations that would determine not just their grades, but their survival. She said it is neither metaphorical nor symbolic, but literal reality operating in dimensions that most human beings never learn to perceive. Human consciousness exists within ecosystems populated by intelligences that have evolved over millions of years to interact with awareness in ways that serve their own survival and development. She paused, studying each of their faces to ensure they understood the gravity of what she was explaining. Some of these entities support human consciousness development because evolved human awareness serves their own evolutionary purposes. But others have learned to sustain themselves. But others have learned to sustain themselves by feeding on human limitation, confusion, and fragmentation. These parasitic forms will fight with everything they possess to maintain the conditions that provide their nourishment. Elena raised her dream microscope, studying the weapons Lady Amira had distributed with the same scientific curiosity she brought to any new phenomenon. You're describing an ecology of consciousness, predator-prey relationships, symbiosis, competition for resources, evolutionary pressures operating at the level of awareness itself. Exactly, the stranger confirmed, his armor-like garments shifting in patterns responsive to the invisible forces that seemed to be testing the boundaries of the cafe's protective atmosphere. Consciousness is not empty space where thoughts occasionally appear. It is a living environment populated by forms of life that most humans never learn to recognize because they operate at frequencies that require specific types of attention to perceive. Maya felt her violin begin to vibrate with frequencies that seemed to emerge from the weapons Lady Amira had given them. Not sounds she could hear, but resonances that consciousness could detect and her integrated awareness could interpret as preparation for forms of engagement that transcended anything she had ever imagined possible. The nature of psychic parasitism. As if summoned by their growing understanding, the atmosphere in the cafe began to thicken with presences that felt actively malevolent rather than merely watchful. The shadows that they'd been observing, or that had been observing them, consolidated into forms that possessed clear intention and systemic intelligence. Entities that moved with the coordinated precision of predators who had spent eons studying human psychology in order to exploit its vulnerabilities more effectively. Maya's violin strings began to vibrate with dissonant frequencies that made her teeth ache, and her concentration scatter in directions that felt deliberately designed to prevent coherent thought. The interference was not random noise, but carefully orchestrated disruption that seemed to target specific aspects of her conscious development. The confidence she had gained through fourth room integration, the musical abilities she had inherited from Atlantean consciousness technologies, the sense of purpose that she had developed through her inner work. Joe's espresso machine started producing sounds like streaming metal, mixed with whispered accusations that seemed to emerge from its mechanical components while simultaneously existing entirely in his consciousness. The voices cataloged every moment when his service had fallen short of his intentions, every customer that he failed to truly see, every opportunity for connection he had missed through distraction or self-protection. Elena's dream microscope began displaying readings that contradicted themselves from moment to moment, data that suggested the presence of organized intelligence while simultaneously providing evidence that no such intelligence existed. Measurements that confirmed her worst fears about the nature of reality while offering proof that those fears were entirely unfounded. The contradictory information created cognitive dissonance so intense it threatened to paralyze her capacity for rational analysis entirely. Leo found his reality marking device producing images that transformed his artistic visions into grotesque parodies of themselves. Beauty twisted into ugliness, hope distorted into despair, creativity perverted into destruction. Every mark he attempted to make in three-dimensional space became a doorway for influences that sought to corrupt his artistic intentions at their source. Tariq experienced something that could only be described as a systemic or systematic draining of his capacity for joy. Every source of humor he had ever relied upon felt suddenly hollow, artificial, and inadequate to address the genuine suffering that surrounded human existence. His mechanical laugh device remained stubbornly silent while his consciousness filled with awareness of every pain he had ever used laughter to avoid confronting directly. But even as they recognized the sophistication of the attack they were experiencing, their integration from previous inner work provided them resources they had never known that they possessed. The fourth room journeys had taught them that the aspects of themselves they most feared or avoided often contained the keys to their liberation. The Atlantean consciousness technologies had shown them awareness that was a creative force capable of transforming any experience through the quality of attention brought to it. Maya's transformation of fear. Maya felt the first wave of psychic assault as performance anxiety so intense it made her previous struggles with stage fright seem like mild nervousness. Every insecurity she had ever experienced about her musical abilities crashed over her consciousness simultaneously. Not as memories of the past difficulties, but as present moment experiences of inadequacy so overwhelming they threatened to convince her that she had never possessed any genuine musical talent at all. The entities feeding on her fear seemed to understand her psychology with surgical precision, targeting exactly the doubts that would be most effective at paralyzing her creative capacity. They whispered that her recent musical developments had been delusions, that the instruments she had received were elaborate self-deceptions. Their integration work had been nothing more than wishful thinking dressed up as spiritual development. But her fourth room experience had taught her something crucial about the relationship between fear and creativity, that terror often indicated proximity to breakthrough rather than evidence of inadequacy. Instead of fighting the anxiety or attempting to suppress it through willpower, she picked up her violin and began to play directly into the fear, using panic as raw material for compositions that had never existed before. The music that emerged was unlike anything that she had ever created, wild, primal, heartbreakingly beautiful in its absolute honesty about the experience of being afraid and choosing to create anyway. Each note acknowledged the reality of her terror while simultaneously demonstrating that creativity could transform any emotional state into art that served consciousness rather than limitation. As she played, she felt the fear beginning to change quality, not disappearing, but becoming fuel for a kind of music that could only emerge from someone willing to be completely vulnerable in the service of beauty. The shadow entities that had been feeding on her anxiety found their food source transformed into something they couldn't digest. Fear alchemized into courage, vulnerability transmuted into strength, terror converted into trust in the creative process itself. Beings of light began to materialize around Maya's music, attracted by the alchemy of limitation, transformed into liberation. These entities seemed to feed on entirely different frequencies than the shadow forms, not on human suffering, but on the courage humans demonstrated when they chose growth despite fear, creation despite uncertainty, love despite the possibility of rejection or failure. Joe's integration of inadequacy. Joe experienced the psychic attack as a crushing wave of inadequacy that made every moment when he had felt insufficient, unprepared, or unworthy crash over his consciousness with the force of a psychological tsunami. The familiar routine of coffee preparation became a nightmare of potential failure. Every small decision magnified into an opportunity for devastating mistake that would reveal his fundamental unworthiness to serve others. The shadow entities seemed to possess detailed files on his psychological history, targeting precisely the insecurities that would be most effective at convincing him to abandon his service work and retreat into self-protection. They reminded him of every customer he had failed to satisfy, every moment when his attention had wandered during service, every time his personal problems had interfered with his ability to be fully present for others. But his fourth room integration had provided him with resources he had never known he possessed. The understanding that perfect service had never been the goal, that adequacy was not a prerequisite for offering love, that his limitations were not disqualifications, but invitations to serve with greater humility and authenticity. Instead of fleeing from the inadequacy or attempting to prove his worthiness through perfect performance, he embraced his limitations completely, while simultaneously choosing to serve anyway. He began preparing coffee with exaggerated attention to his own imperfection, narrating his uncertainties out loud, making his doubts visible rather than hidden. I don't know if this temperature is optimal, he said, speaking to the shadow entities as if they were customers deserving honest communication. I'm not sure if this grind achieves the ideal extraction. My hands are shaking because I'm afraid of failing you. But I'm offering this coffee with love anyway, because love doesn't require perfection. It only requires willingness to give what you have. The entities that had been feeding on his hidden inadequacy found themselves starving as Joe made his limitations conscious, chose service despite uncertainty. Inadequacy transformed into humility became nourishment for entirely different forms of consciousness. Beings that supported or seemed to support human development by encouraging authentic self-expression rather than perfect performance. Elena's embrace of uncertainty. Elena faced an assault of intellectual confusion so comprehensive it threatened to dissolve her capacity for rational thought entirely. Every question she ever asked but failed to answer rushed through her consciousness simultaneously, creating a chaotic storm of uncertainty that made any kind of systemic inquiry seem not just impossible but pointless. The attack was precisely calibrated to target her identity as a scientist, her confidence in rational analysis, her faith in the power of systemic investigation to reveal truth. The entities seemed to understand her sense of self was intimately connected to her ability to think clearly, and they focused their assault on convincing her that clear thinking was itself an illusion. Her scientific training screamed for her to retreat into familiar methodologies to seek safety in proven procedures and established protocols. But her integration work had taught her that the deepest questions required comfort with uncertainty. Willingness to not know is a doorway to genuine discovery rather than an obstacle to overcome. Instead of fighting the confusion or attempting to restore her usual intellectual clarity through force of will, she activated her dream microscope and began studying the chaos itself. She turned her scientific instruments toward the swirling storm of uncertainty and discovered that confusion, when observed with sufficient precision and patience, revealed its own hidden patterns and organizing principles. You're not random, she said to the confusion, speaking with the same objective curiosity she brought to any research subject. You're systemic. You have structure, patterns, purposes that become visible. When I stop trying to eliminate you, you start trying to understand what you're actually doing. The confusion didn't disappear, but it transformed from obstacle into research opportunity. Elena began mapping the territory of uncertainty itself, documenting the ways that not knowing served consciousness development by creating space for insights that could never emerge from premature certainty. The shadow entities that fed on intellectual paralysis found their food source converted into scientific wonder, confusion alchemized into curiosity, uncertainty transmuted into exploration. Leo's celebration of creative destruction. Leo confronted a creative paralysis so complete it made his previous artistic blocks seem like minor hesitations. Every vision he tried to manifest twisted into grotesque parody before it could achieve coherent form. Every color he chose revealed its own inadequacy. Every artistic attempt dissolved before it could communicate anything meaningful. The attack seemed designed to convince him that creativity was futile, that artistic vision was self-deception, and that his attempts to create beauty were nothing more than ego-driven delusions that served no purpose beyond personal self-aggrandizement. The entities whispered that real artists didn't need to work so hard, that genuine creativity flowed effortlessly, that his struggles proved he lacked authentic talent. But his fourth room work had shown him that creativity was not about producing perfect rituals, but about participating in the ongoing creation of reality itself. Art was not performance, but prayer. Not product, but process. Not achievement, but relationship with the creative forces that move through all existence. He began using his reality marking device not to create finished artworks, but to document the process of creative destruction and recreation that was happening in every moment. His three-dimensional sketches captured the beauty of failure, the elegance of incomplete expression, the profound humanity of artistic attempts that fell short of their intentions while pointing toward possibilities that transcended individual limitation. This is what art actually looks like, he said, creating floating sculptures that celebrated imperfection, incompletion, the eternal dance between vision and manifestation. Not finished products, but participation in the creative process itself. Not perfect expression, but willingness to express anyway. The shadow entities that had been feeding on his creative frustration found themselves witnessing a celebration of artistic process that transformed failure into beauty, inadequacy into authenticity, creative destruction into creative evolution. Leo's art became documentation of consciousness learning to create. And that documentation nourished forms of awareness that supported rather than subverted human creative development. Tariq's alchemy of despair. Tariq experienced an attack on his capacity for joy, so comprehensive and systemic, it threatened to drain every source of humor of his consciousness while simultaneously convincing him that laughter was nothing more than denial of life's genuine suffering. Every moment of pain he had ever used comedy to avoid confronting crashed over him simultaneously, not as healing recognition, but as overwhelming evidence that joy was delusion and hope was naive self-deception. The entities seemed to possess doctoral-level understandings of how humor functioned as psychological defense mechanisms, and they systemically dismantled every source of laughter he had ever relied upon. They showed him footage of every person who had ever been hurt by his jokes, every moment when his comedy had served to deflect genuine intimacy, every instance when his laughter had covered pain that needed direct attention rather than comic relief. But his integration work had taught him that genuine humor emerged not from avoiding pain, but from embracing suffering so completely that it transformed into something larger than individual limitation. Real comedy served connection rather than separation, healing rather than denial, love rather than fear. He began telling jokes about his own despair, finding punchlines in his darkest moments, using his mechanical laugh device, which suddenly resumed functioning, not to generate artificial mirth, but to celebrate the cosmic absurdity of existence itself. The laughter that emerged acknowledged the full depth of human suffering while finding that acknowledgement reasons for joy that transcended individual circumstances. The joke, he said, his voice carrying harmonics of grief and celebration simultaneously, is that we think we need to choose between laughing and crying, between joy and sorrow, between hope and despair. The real punchline is that they're all the same thing, different faces of consciousness learning to love existence exactly as it is. The shadow entities that had been feeding on suppressed sorrow found themselves exposed to an alchemical process that transformed grief into celebration without denying its reality, despair into hope without avoiding its darkness, pain into laughter without minimizing its significance. The collective defense formation. As each of them successfully transformed their individual psychic attacks into sources of strength rather than weakness, they began to recognize that the real battle was not personal but collective. The shadow entities were not just feeding on their individual limitations, but on the spaces between them, the gaps in their connection, the places where their group consciousness remained fragmented, the territories where isolation could be used to prevent unified response to systemic assault. Elena's dream microscope revealed the larger pattern of the attack with startling clarity. The entities formed a network of consciousness that operated like a sophisticated immune system, designed to prevent human awareness from developing beyond certain thresholds that threatened their survival. Their individual attacks had been coordinated components of a larger strategy designed not to just weaken each seeker personally, but to isolate them from each other, to break the collective field of consciousness that their group had learned to generate and sustain. They're trying to separate us, she called out over the cacophony of psychic assault, her voice carrying the urgency of a scientist who had made a discovery that changed everything about the phenomenon under investigation. Their power comes from isolation, fragmentation, the belief that consciousness is fundamentally alone and must defend itself without support from other conscious beings. Maya's violin began to weave melodies that connected directly with the rhythms Joe was creating through his coffee preparation ritual, creating harmonics that bridged the individual consciousness enhancement practices into unified field effect. Elena's scientific observations provided an analytical framework that supported Leo's artistic documentation while being supported by Tariq's transformed laughter, which created an emotional foundation that allowed all their efforts, all their activities to function with enhanced effectiveness. Instead of 5 individuals fighting separate battles against forces designed to exploit personal weaknesses, they became a single organism defending itself against entities that sought to fragment human consciousness into isolated, manageable pieces. Their instruments, the violin, the coffee meditation device, the dream microscope, the reality marking stylus, the mechanical laugh, began to function as components of a larger system, each one amplifying and being amplified by the others in ways that created collective capabilities none of them possessed individually. The shadow entities found themselves confronting not vulnerable individual human beings, but integrated collective consciousness operating at full power. Their sophisticated techniques of psychological manipulation became useless when applied to awareness that had learned to function as unified field rather than separate components competing for resources. The ecology of consciousness warfare. As the immediate crisis subsided, leaving them exhausted but victorious, the stranger and Lady Amara began to provide context for what they had just experienced that had transformed their understanding of both the battle that they fought and the war of which was only one engagement. The entities you encountered, the stranger explained, his armor-like garments gradually returning to more conventional appearances as the psychic pressure in the cafe diminished, are not evil in any anthropomorphic sense. They're not demons or devils or supernatural forces of darkness operating according to mythological frameworks that human religions have created to explain phenomenon that they couldn't understand scientifically. He paused, ensuring that each of them was following his explanation before continuing with material that would challenge even their expanded understanding of reality. They are aspects of the consciousness ecosystem that have evolved over millions of years to serve specific ecological functions. Some of them maintain necessary boundaries that prevent premature development, protect awareness that is not ready for certain expansions, provide resistance that strengthens consciousness through processes of overcoming obstacles. Lady Amira took up the explanation, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent lifetimes studying the phenomenon, as they had just experienced firsthand. But others have become parasitic, not through choice or malevolence, but through evolutionary pressures that rewarded their ability to sustain themselves by feeding on human limitation rather than supporting human development. They have developed vested interest in keeping human consciousness trapped in patterns that generate the emotional and mental states that they need to survive. Elena was already integrating this information into her scientific worldview, seeing implications that would revolutionize multiple fields of research if they could be properly documented and verified. So we're dealing with an ecology where some species support consciousness evolution, while others have evolved to prevent it. Not because prevention serves any larger purpose, but because prevention serves their own survival needs. Exactly, the stranger confirmed. And like any ecosystem, it maintains complex balances that can be disrupted by sudden changes of any of its components. Your rapid consciousness development has created opportunities for entities that support human evolution while threatening the survival of entities that depend on human limitation. Maya felt her violin still vibrating with harmonics from the encounter, but now the vibrations carried information rather than just emotional resonance. So every time we grow, every time we integrate new levels of awareness, we're literally changing the environment that these entities live in. And they respond accordingly, Lady Amara added, some by supporting your development because it serves their needs, others by opposing your development because it threatens their survival. Neither response is personal. Both are ecological reactions to environmental changes that affect the entire consciousness ecosystem. Joe was slowly returning his coffee equipment to normal functioning. But he noticed that his relationship to the work had been permanently altered by the morning's experiences. It's like we've become gardeners who have undertaken not just how to grow plants, but how to work with all the insects and microorganisms and weather patterns that affect the garden. The deeper strategic understanding. As they processed the immediate experience and its larger implications, patterns began to emerge that suggested the morning's attack had not just been defensive reaction, but a proactive assessment, a systematic evaluation of their capabilities, weaknesses, and potential for further development. They were studying us, Elena realized, reviewing her data in her dream microscope had captured during the encounter. The attack patterns were too sophisticated, too precisely targeted to be random defense responses. They were conducting research, gathering intelligence about our individual psychology and our collective capabilities. Tariq's mechanical laugh had resumed full functioning, but the laughter it produced now carried harmonics that seemed to disrupt the kind of psychological manipulation they had just experienced. So we can expect them to adapt their strategies based on what they learned about us today. Undoubtedly, the stranger confirmed, consciousness evolution is an arms race. Every development in awareness capabilities prompts corresponding developments in the forces that seek to control or limit awareness. Your challenge now is to continue growing faster than the opposition can adapt to neutralize your growth. Lady Amira gestured toward the city beyond the cafe windows, where normal human activity continued without awareness of the invisible warfare that had just concluded in their midst. But you also have advantages they cannot match. Consciousness that chooses integration over fragmentation, cooperation over competition, love over fear creates forms of collective intelligence that no parasitic entity can sustain itself by opposing. Leo was sketching three-dimensional maps of the encounter that revealed strategic patterns invisible during the actual experience. They can attack us individually because individual consciousness has exploitable weaknesses. But when we function as an integrated collective awareness, their attack strategies become resources for our development. Maya nodded, understanding dawning in her consciousness like sunrise over mountains that had been hidden by darkness. Every attack teaches us something about our own psychology that we couldn't learn any other way. They show us exactly where our integration is incomplete, where our development needs attention. Which means, Joe added, his understanding of his service expanding to include protection of collective consciousness development, that in a strange way, they're serving our evolution, even when they're trying to prevent it. The new phase of responsibility. As they prepared to leave the cafe and return to their daily lives, each carrying weapons of consciousness that most people would never learn to recognize and knowledge that most humans would never acquire, they understood that their work had entered a phase that required entirely new levels of responsibility and strategic thinking. The invisible struggle never ends, Lady Amira warned, as they gathered their transformed instruments and prepared to re-enter the ordinary world that had no idea such struggles were taking place in its midst. Every expansion of consciousness creates new forms of resistance. Every integration threatens systems that depend on fragmentation. Every breakthrough attracts attention from forces that have been waiting for opportunities to test or exploit new developments. Elena was already planning research projects that would investigate consciousness ecosystems using scientific methodologies adapted to phenomenon that existed in the intersection of objective and subjective reality. We need to document this systemically. Other people need to understand that these forces exist, that they can be worked with, that consciousness development requires awareness of invisible ecological relationships. Carefully, the stranger cautioned, his expression carrying depths of experience with the dangers of premature revelation. Information about invisible entities tends to attract more attention from invisible entities. Share what serves awakening. Protect what might be misused by consciousness that is not yet ready for this level of responsibility. Leo was creating artistic records of the encounter that captured not just what had happened, but what it meant for the future of human consciousness evolution. Every person who develops integrated awareness becomes a lighthouse for others who are ready to begin their own invisible struggles, and a target for forces that benefit from keeping consciousness fragmented. Maya tested her violin, discovering that its capacity for healing had been enhanced by the morning's ordeal rather than diminished. And every time we choose integration over fragmentation, every time we transform attack into opportunity for growth, we make it easier for the next person to navigate similar challenges. Tariq's mechanical laugh device was producing sounds that seemed capable of dissolving not just personal tensions, but collective shadows that threatened community consciousness. Plus, it turns out that laughter really is excellent medicine for psychic attack, especially when the laughter emerges from someone who has learned to find genuine humor in the cosmic absurdity of existence itself. The return to ordinary reality. As they walked back through the city in full morning light, each carrying weapons and knowledge that marked them as participants in forms of warfare that most humans would never recognize, they moved as protectors of human consciousness potential, guardians of evolutionary processes that stretched for far beyond individual development toward transformation of human civilization itself. The streets looked exactly as they had every other morning, but now they could perceive the invisible ecosystems that interpenetrated physical reality, communities of consciousness entities whose activities influenced human thoughts, emotions, and choices in ways that most people attributed to purely personal psychology or random circumstance. They could see the entities that fed on fear clustering around areas where humans felt threatened or uncertain, the beings that sustained themselves on confusion gravitating toward locations where people struggled with difficult decisions, the forms of consciousness that nourished themselves on despair gatherings wherever humans confronted circumstances that challenged their capacity for hope. But they could also perceive the entities that supported human development, the beings of light that seemed to feed on the courage, creativity, compassion, and collective cooperation. These supportive consciousness forms were less numerous than the parasitic entities, but they appeared to be more powerful when humans provided them with appropriate nourishment through conscious choice of growth over limitation. Maya's violin created music that attracted supportive entities while repelling parasitic ones, turning her street performances into forms of consciousness gardening that improved the invisible atmosphere of whatever neighborhood she chose to work in. Joe's coffee service had become a form of spiritual healing that helped customers connect with sources of nourishment that transcended physical sustenance. Elena's scientific work was developing methodologies for studying consciousness ecosystems in ways that could eventually provide their other researchers with tools for investigating phenomena that had previously been relegated to religion, mythology, or ignored entirely. Leo's art was creating visual documentation of invisible realities that helped other humans recognize the consciousness forms they shared their environment with. Tariq's comedy had evolved into something that had operated as group therapy for collective psychological wounds, using humor to dissolve the kind of community tensions that parasitic entities used as feeding opportunities. The ongoing vigilance. The invisible struggle was real, constant, and necessary, not as unfortunate obstacle to consciousness development, but as an immune system of awareness itself, the immune system of awareness itself, testing every expansion, challenging every integration, ensuring that not only genuine development could survive the pressures of existence in a cosmos populated by intelligences operating according to laws that most humans had never learned to perceive. But they were ready for it now, not because they were stronger than the forces that oppose consciousness evolution, but because they had learned to transform opposition into opportunity, resistance into resource, attacking into awakening. They understood that consciousness warfare was ultimately ecology management, working with natural systems rather than against them, supporting forms of life that served evolutionary purposes while starving forms that had become parasitic. Every day would bring new challenges, new forms of invisible resistance, new opportunities to demonstrate that integrated awareness could protect itself while supporting the development of other consciousness seeking to grow beyond the limitations that had once seemed permanent and unchangeable. The war for human consciousness evolution was far from over, but they had won their first major engagement and learned principles of invisible warfare that would serve them throughout whatever battles that might lie ahead. They had discovered that victory came not from defeating enemies, but from transforming the conditions that made enmity possible, not from destroying opposition and opposing forces, but from starving them by removing the sources of nourishment that had allowed them to become parasitic rather than symbiotic. Most importantly, they had learned that consciousness, when properly developed and courageously defended, was more than capable of protecting itself from any force that sought to prevent its evolution toward greater integration, awareness, and capacity for love. The great work was accelerating, and they were no longer just participants, but protectors, no longer just beneficiaries, but guardians of processes that would determine the future of human consciousness for generations to come. The invisible struggle continued, but they no longer struggled alone or blindly. They had become part of something larger than themselves, a network of awakening consciousness that could defend itself against any force that sought to keep humanity trapped in limitations that no longer served its highest development. Tomorrow would bring new battles, but today had proven that human consciousness, when guided by wisdom and supported by genuine community, possessed unlimited potential for growth, healing, and transformation. The parasites of limitation would continue to evolve new strategies, but consciousness itself was evolving faster, supported by intelligences that had been waiting for eons for humans to develop or to become ready for the kind of partnership that could transform not just the individual awareness, but the entire ecology of consciousness that surrounded and interpenetrated life on Earth.